Hello and welcome to the third and final installment of The Press-Ganged Surgeon, an excerpt from The Adventures of Roderick Ransom by Tobias Smollett. Last week, our hero had begun to accustom himself to the peculiarities of shipboard life. Now serving as third mate to the surgeon of HMS Thunder, he has just made his first foray into the ship's sickbay, and been horrified at the wretched condition in which the ship's sick are expected to recuperate. We rejoin him just after finishing supper with his new messmates. Supper being over, Mr. Morgan having smoked a couple of pipes and supplied the moisture he had expended with as many cans of flip, of which we all partook, a certain yawning began to admonish me that it was high time to repair by sleep the injury I had suffered from want of rest the preceding night, which, being perceived by my companions, whose time of repose was now arrived, they proposed we should turn in, or, in other words, go to bed. Our hammocks, which hung parallel to one another on the outside of the berth, were immediately unlashed, and I beheld my messmates spring with great agility into their respective nests, where they seemed to lie concealed, very much at their ease. But it was some time before I could prevail upon myself to trust my carcass at such a distance from the ground, in a narrow bag, out of which, I imagined, I should be apt, at the least motion in my sleep, to tumble down at the hazard of breaking my bones. I suffered myself, however, to be persuaded, and, taking the leap to get in, threw myself quite over with such violence that had I not luckily got hold of Thompson's hammock, I should have pitched upon my head on the other side, and in all likelihood fractured my skull. After some fruitless efforts, I succeeded at last, but the apprehension of the jeopardy in which I believed myself withstood all the attacks of sleep, till towards the morning watch, when, in spite of my fears, I was overpowered with slumber. Though I did not long enjoy this comfortable situation, being aroused with a noise so loud and shrill that I thought the drums of my ears were burst by it. This was followed by a dreadful summons, pronounced by a hoarse voice, which I could not understand. While I was debating with myself whether or not I should wake my companion and inquire into the occasion of this disturbance, I was informed, by one of the quartermasters who passed with a lantern in his hand, that the noise which alarmed me was occasioned by the boatswain's mates, who called up the larboard watch, and that I must lay my account with such an interruption every morning at the same hour. Being now more assured of my safety, I undressed myself again to rest, and slept till 8 o'clock, when, rising and breakfasting with my comrades on biscuit and brandy, the sick were visited and assisted as before. After which visitation, my good friend Thompson explained and performed another piece of duty to which I was a stranger. At a certain hour in the morning, the boy of the mess went round all decks, ringing a small handbell, and, in rhymes composed for the occasion, invited all those who had sores to repair before the mast, where one of the doctor's mates attended, with applications to dress them. A short while later, Morgan received a message from the surgeon to bring the sick list to the quarterdeck, for the captain had ordered all the patients thither to be reviewed. This inhuman order shocked us extremely, as we knew well it would be impossible to carry some of the sick onto deck without immediate danger of their lives. But, as we likewise knew it would be of no purpose for us to remonstrate against it, we repaired to the quarterdeck in a body to see this extraordinary muster. Morgan observed, by the way, that the captain was going to send to the other world a great many souls who would testify in evidence against him. We appeared on the deck, and the captain bade the doctor, who stood bowing at his right hand, look at these lazy, lubberly sons of bitches, who are good for nothing on board but to eat the king's provisions and encourage idleness in the skulkers. The surgeon grinned approbation, and, taking the list, began to examine the complaints of each, as they could crawl to the place allotted. The first who came under his cognizance was a poor fellow just freed of a fever, which had weakened him so much that he could hardly stand. Mr. McShane, for that was the doctor's name, having felt his pulse, protested that he was as well as any man in the world, and the captain delivered him over to the boatswain's mate, with orders that he should receive a round dozen at the gangway immediately, for counterfeiting himself sick. But before the discipline could be executed, the man dropped down on the deck and had well nigh perished under the hands of the executioner. The next patient to be considered labored under a quartan ague, and, being then in his interval of health, discovered no other symptoms of distemper than a pale and meagre countenance and an emaciated body, upon which he was declared fit for duty and turned over to the boatswain, but, being resolved to disgrace the doctor, died upon the forecastle the next day during his cold fit. The third complained of a pleuritic stitch and spitting of blood, for which Dr. McShane prescribed exercise at the pumps to promote expectoration. Whether this was improper for one in his situation, or that it was used to excess, I do not know, but in less than half an hour he was suffocated with a deluge of blood that issued from his lungs. A fourth, with much difficulty, climbed to the quarterdeck, being loaded with a monstrous ascites, or dropsy, that invaded his chest so much he could scarce fetch his breath. But his disease being interpreted as fat, occasioned by idleness and excessive eating, he was ordered, with a view to promote perspiration and enlarge his chest, to go aloft at once. It was in vain for this unwieldy wretch to allege his utter incapacity. The boatswain's driver was commanded to whip him up with the cat of nine tails. The smart of this application made him exert himself so much that he actually arrived at the futtock shrouds. But when the enormous weight of his body had nothing else to support it than his weakened arms, either out of spite or necessity, he quitted his hold and plunged into the sea. He must surely there have been drowned, had not a sailor who was alongside in a boat saved his life by keeping him afloat until he was hoisted on board by a tackle. It would be tedious and disagreeable to describe the fate of every miserable object that suffered by the inhumanity and arrogance of the captain and surgeon, who so wantonly sacrificed the lives of their fellow creatures. Many were brought up in the height of fevers and rendered delirious by injuries they received along the way. Some gave up the ghost in the presence of their inspectors, and others, who were ordered to their duties, languished a few days at working among their fellows, and then departed without any ceremony. On the whole, the number of sick was reduced to less than a dozen, and the authors of this reduction applauded themselves for the services they had done to their king and country. Well, a sad and morbid conclusion to our story, but unfortunately not atypical of life on some of His Majesty's ships. It also illustrates the tremendous power wielded over a ship's company by the captain, truly that of life and death. It is, in fact, sometimes said that a captain in the Royal Navy has more power on board his own vessel than does the King of England, for even the king cannot order a subject executed without a fair trial. In theory, of course, the same is true of a captain, who must court-martial a sailor before administering the death penalty. But in reality, a captain's authority often far exceeds what is set down in law. At any rate, I do hope that this series has gone some little way towards keeping you entertained during these dark, cold winter months. Until we next meet, fare thee well.